Hello and welcome to this special one-off vlogcast. Oh, that's rubbish. Hello and
Sorry.
hello and welcome to this special one-off Game Developers Conference audio track-centric vlogcast, if there is such a thing, with all four members of the GDC Audio Advisory Board. We have Penka Kouneva.
Hello.
Scott Selfon.
Hello.
And Brian Schmidt.
Hello.
And I'm Kenny Young. Hello. So today we're going to discuss and hopefully demystify the submission process for GDC in an effort to both encourage people to submit for the conference and to alleviate the frustrations of people who have been repeatedly rejected by us, but also really to try and help increase the quality of submissions. And we'll do that by giving you insight into many of the common reasons why we reject talks. The idea being that hopefully you can avoid making those pitfalls in your submission this year. Much of this information is actually available online already on the GDC submission website, but it's pretty clear that quite a lot of people either haven't found that information or just haven't read it. So we thought we'd try and present that information in a slightly different format, just so the community can interface with it in a different way, and hopefully it will enter the Borg hive mind of game audio going forward. So let's get started. Who wants to tell us about the process of submitting a talk and what happens and what we do with people's submissions? Brian, you've got a big smile.
I can jump in and do that. Sure. So, yeah, I know it sometimes seems like you submit a talk and it goes into this mysterious black hole, and then some months later, weeks later, out pops an acceptance or rejectance. What actually happens is that we grade each of the incoming submissions, and we get usually over 100 per year, so we have a lot of them to go through. We grade them individually, hiding comments from each other, and then after we've done all of that, we actually meet together once a year at an offsite that they put the entire GDC advisory board to, and we meet for about 3 days. Heads down, heads together, and painstakingly go through each of the submissions one by one. And that's where we'll review as a group the scores that we gave each of the individual talks, and then talk about, hey, what did we like? What's the balance of talks? Do we have a lot of music talks, a lot of sound design talks, and so on? And out of that process comes a list of talks that we think are ready to go on to what's phase 2. Phase 2 is a little bit deeper dive. That's where some of you who have done GDC talks before know that we'll ask you to give us a substantially complete presentation. We'll have some concrete feedback for you. And then after phase 2 is done and we've looked at your sort of updated submission for that, that's when we make the final call on the talks. So it's kind of a multi-step process from submission, initial scoring, group scoring, make it onto phase 2, and then the talks themselves.
Cool. And so that's the submission process. In terms of the submissions themselves, what makes for a good GDC talk? What is it that we're looking for from people when they spend that time writing down their ideas for a talk?
Yeah, so at the most basic level, I think I can try and take this. But at the most basic level, we're looking for the kinds of talks that will actually be well received and well rated by the people who actually attend GDC, and that we believe will want to attend this talk. And that's one of, I think, the biggest challenges in the audio track, is that we cater to composers, sound designers, programmers, implementers, voiceover artists. We have such a wide and diverse range of people who make the audio track their home during the Game Developer Conference. And that kind of speaks to what Brian was talking about a little bit, which is we want to make sure that we have a good diversity of material. So in many years, we'll have a ton of great submissions, but we can, we don't want to over-index towards, for example, composers at the, at the cost of sound designers not having content. And that comes all the way back to when we're, once we've even made our acceptance list, we then continue to work on trying to make sure that we create a schedule where everyone will have one, or sometimes we get the complaints, sometimes it's positive, but multiple choices of talks that they can go to at any given hour that will be high value and high relevance for them. So that's kind of what we're looking for from talks. Now, what does that mean more specifically? So we're looking for talks where there's going to be highly relevant takeaways. So things that I'm going to be able to take and use immediately in my day job, whether that's something that's learning how to extend and expand my career, whether it's learning a new technical solution to a problem that I might face, or whether it's being able to extend and expand my craft by learning from someone else and what their experiences were with a specific game. So that, I think, kind of holistically speaks to what we're looking for, from the best submissions. We can talk next, I think, about some of the gaps that we see in some of the talks that are kind of not the easier ones to not accept, I would say, but ones where we need to probe a little bit more if we're going to consider them. So does anyone else want to jump in?
Do you mean?
May I jump in?
Go for it, Penka.
I wanted to say, in my first years at GDC, I was paying the full pass, and GDC is the top world conference and also an expensive conference to attend. So in a sense, I almost think of it as a place I would go and learn a lot of knowledge, almost like in an academic sense, that there's a huge learning component to attending to GDC. And if you only go to the audio track, that's also pretty expensive. So when we have to make sure that our attendees who come to these lectures learn as much as they can and have a very deep takeaway, and again, with knowledge that's relevant to their needs, that's current, and will definitely enhance their skills, their process, as if they're coming to school, to some really high elevated form of learning. And that's why the takeaway is always very much emphasized. We have to ask ourselves the question, what is the takeaway of this talk? Who's going to attend it? How much are they going to learn? How relevant is this knowledge to their skills? And in my opinion, that's one of the highest, most important criteria. Amazing takeaway from your talk.
And the other thing that you mentioned, academia there, and what it reminded me of is that one of the first things you see in the submissions website is a little description of the process, which Brian was talking about there. And to compare it to some of the best known and most highly regarded technical and academic conferences, what they expect from people submitting a talk is to actually submit a paper, which is essentially gives, if we were the advisory board in that conference, we would be able to evaluate the content relatively easily because it would be all there. We're not asking people to submit, a completely dense, well thought through thing. Well, hopefully, like a little bit well thought through. But it's like, it's not a paper. We're not, it's not an academic conference. We are very much aware of the fact that people are game developers. They are busy people, and so they don't actually. It's not their job to put out their research necessarily. So we don't expect people to submit a paper. What we want to see really is an interesting idea. Like you say, it's going to have good takeaway for people, and to split that down into what the takeaway is. So the high level topics that you'll be covering in your talk, and ideally, and a good submission actually gives you a little bit of insight into each of those topics. I think that's maybe a good segue to get into talking about common mistakes that we encounter.
Well, before we do that, I might have a slight disagreement on something you just said there, Kenny.
Shoot me.
Certainly, we don't have the requirement like we do at an AES or a SIGGRAPH or something like that, where you have to submit the paper. That said, the amount of time people have spent prepping their initial presentation pretty heavily factors into things. It tells us a couple of things. It tells us your idea is very well thought out. It tells us that you've taken the time and effort to create a thoughtful and thorough proposal. And that is some brownie points in the plus position. If we see a submission and it's got a paper with a detailed description of what it is, or it has a first draft of the PowerPoint deck, that's 30 slides long in some detail, that speaks a lot to us because, again, back to Penka's point, this is sort of the premier conference to speak at for this stuff. And we want people who go into it knowing the amount of work and effort that it goes into it. So that, at least in my view, is heavily weighted as opposed to seeing just a couple paragraphs. Oh, I'm going to talk about this, and that's it.
Yeah, and just to build on what Brian said, I think one of the common mistakes that we see is for people to kind of tease what they're going to talk about, but not give the advisory board enough detail to be able to say, oh, okay, I understand this is going to be something that is novel and is something that people have never heard about before. Confusing the abstract that's going to be in the printed program from what your submission is. And so that's one of the things that that is a common mistake that we see is a submission that is basically the abstract as they would expect it to be printed, rather than, no, these are the actual detailed topics,
so basically,
topic areas that I plan to hit.
It says it's novel, but doesn't give us an insight as to why it's novel.
Yes.
Correct. And this actually is sort of a meta point, and this is explicitly stated on the website. When you're doing a submission, don't say, we're going to talk about X. Say, we're going to talk about how we solved X. We solved it by this and this and this and this. And as Scott said, don't confuse your submission, which is selling us on your presentation, with the abstract, which can be kind of teaser-like that would eventually be published in the in the conference, in the guidelines in the program.
One way that I think about that stuff, and that is probably one of the most common problems, as you say, Scott. It comes up on so many of the talks that we reject, where we really just have no idea if the talk's going to be any good or not, even if we think it's an interesting idea. And that's not always a complete deal breaker, because obviously we have these different phases. And so if there is a really interesting talk idea that actually is a weak submission, sometimes we'll take that through to the next phase, and at that point ask the speaker to give us more detail. However, that's a little bit of a risky strategy, so I'm not recommending that people do that, because in a borderline case where there's a talk that it's an interesting idea, but it's, there's just not enough there for us to evaluate whether the speaker A knows what they're talking about and B has good takeaway for people. If there's another submission that's on a similar topic that's a better submission, then your weaker submission is going to fall by the wayside. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend assuming that we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and give us more work for phase 2 of the submission process. But the way I think about that stuff is, if you don't give us enough detail, you're kind of making the assumption that us on the advisory board actually know enough about the topic that you are submitting to be able to tell from your high-level overview of the talk that it is interesting. There's a lot of people here who've been working in games for a long time, and we do have a broad range of experience, but you do need to tell us what it is about your talk that's interesting. You can't assume that we understand why certain topics are interesting without giving us that information. If you genuinely have a talk where you can communicate what is interesting about it from that high level, you probably don't have a very good talk. It's probably obvious what it is you're going to be saying. So detail is important. You've got to have a bit of that in there. It's not the finished talk, but it can't just be so high level and abstracted that there's nothing for us there to evaluate.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, because taking postmortems as an example, you could just spend the entire time talking about your specific detailed experience with this game, and someone could emerge from that talk saying, well, I'm working on games that are completely different, or team dynamics that are completely different. And so to some extent, you do need to be able to elevate the conversation to, what are the things that I learned from this game that I can take forward to my next game, and that everyone else who's attending this talk can take forward to their diverse experiences. But we definitely want to see that level of specificity, but also the generalization, again, to what Penka was saying, to make sure that there is a takeaway that is going to be high value for everyone who attends the talk.
I wanted to help the composers working in the independent sphere. I wanted to give them more specific tips, because often we would say, oh, this topic is too niche, or who has played that game? It's not a very popular game. And I know a lot of attendees of GDC work at that level, where they work on independent games or mobile games or casual. And let's help the people submitting topics about indie games, how they can fine-tune their submission so that, again, the takeaway is significant and substantial. And in other words, how to combat that sort of perception, oh, this is too niche, or this game nobody has played. In other words, if you have worked on a small game, but it has a very interesting sonic approach or sound design approach or interesting workflow, then describe that to us so that we see how this will benefit everybody else who is attending your talk. Because again, the most important thing is we have to think how your talk is going to benefit 40, 50, 60, 200 people, 300 people who come to these lectures. And so maybe, would you like to discuss how to fine-tune submissions about indie games or mobile games and make them most appealing for us to accept?
I think that the truth is that it doesn't actually matter if you're working on an indie game. Fundamentally, you can't make the assumption, especially my last point, you can't make the assumption that the people in us four, that we know your game. You can't rely on the reputation of your game to sell your talk, and you can't rely on your reputation as a professional to sell your talk. You need to have the takeaway for your talk in the submission. So that's one thing is, whatever your key points are, put them in the submission. Don't assume that because your game has might have had amazing critical reception in the press, say, or from gamers for certain aspects of its audio experience. You have to spell that out for us, and ideally, if it really is something novel, you can submit along with your presentation video clips. You can upload certain different file types alongside the text that you have to submit. That can be really, really useful for us and help us get us up to speed on a project which we might not be familiar with. So that's one tip I would give, is that's an option to you.
Yeah, I'd say it's I mean, and to just add on to what Penka said before, I think we're looking for a diversity of experiences. So as Kenny said, we're not looking for the entirety of the GDC audio track to be, covering just all the latest blockbuster games. And by the way, some of the most amazing game audio implementations are for games that frankly did not critically fare as well. So we're looking for a diversity of game types, game experiences, and a diversity of speakers. I think that's another good opportunity for us to hammer home on. I love to see submissions from people who are first-time composers and sound designers in the industry and what their experiences were, with keeping in mind the idea that we want to have takeaways for other composers and sound designers who are in the same position, but also for people who are veterans and have been there for a long time. So, I really like to see new people talking. I don't like to see the same people presenting year in and year out at the conference. And so that's one of the things that I think we really push for, is to get as broad a diversity of people submitting as possible. And just trying to get new and different voices involved in the GDC audio track. But it's also worth
sorry, go Brian.
Go ahead.
Related to that, I was going to say, if you haven't spoken publicly before at all, GDC is probably not the best place to pop your cherry. So we do expect people to have some public speaking experience. You're going to be talking in front of your peers. Very experienced professionals and newcomers alike, and it's really important that you are comfortable speaking. If you haven't got any experience of doing that, that will be a mark against you. There are rare cases where we have progressed someone's talk to phase 2 if they don't have any experience, but we make them get experience before we let them speak at GDC as part of that process. So if you want to prop up your submission, make sure that you have got some public speaking experience, either at local colleges or perhaps if you work in-house at your company, or at local game developer meetups. There are lots of opportunities out there that are available to do public speaking. So make sure you have explored that a bit before you submit to GDC, because you don't want to stand up in front of everyone and then vomit on the microphone. That would be bad.
That was the point I was going to make as well, Kenny, that GDC is not the place to cut your teeth giving presentations. There's lots of good places to give them: schools, universities, other conferences. If you've never spoken before, schedule one for your team, videotape it, include it in your submission material. Otherwise, it's generally pretty tough for us to take somebody who literally has no speaking history, where we can't either go to a major conference website and see they've spoken, or click on a video somewhere and see them talking. That's just a GDC thing they like to do. You don't want somebody who gets up there and just reads their paper, and it's very boring. I've only ever seen one person ever be able to pull off reading a presentation. He actually does it very, very well, but that's definitely the exception to the rule.
Penka, did you have any? Sorry, I feel like we went off track a little bit from your point about helping indies. Did you have any other information there?
Brian has a really good list, and I would love for him to go down that list because there are more points on his list which are awesome. I just wanted to emphasize again about the public speaking element. It's really tough. It's intimidating. The GDC halls are large, and there's these shining lights shining in your face, and you don't see the audience, and there's echo bouncing around. And we do ask all participants to rehearse their talks, not once, but even twice, to rehearse with an audience, just to really break that stage fright and feel most confident. And just from my own past experience, it took me a couple of years to really feel confident, and I did a lot of speaking. But again, GDC presentations are tough because you have a large audience, anywhere between 50 and 300 people. And it takes practice. It takes real, genuine practice. And again, the conference at large demands that the speakers are most inspiring and effective and seasoned. And of course, we want fresh voices and fresh faces, that's for sure. But the conference just wants to emphasize on the speakers being most efficient and most persuasive and again, educational, because the most important thing for GDC at large is everybody who attends the conference learns the most and really has that gigantic takeaway that we keep coming back to.
I thought I would throw a random stat in there, which is the on the audio track last year, or the 2017 conference, 51% of speakers in the audio track were new faces who hadn't spoken at GDC before. So I think that's a good... which, to be honest, that ran contrary to what my assumptions were about speakers at GDC. I don't know what the stats were for previous years, but I think that's a mark of the fact that we're doing something right there in terms of making sure that it's not just the same old faces speaking. So if you haven't spoken at GDC before, don't feel like it's a club and that you're excluded. Similarly, if you've been rejected from GDC repeatedly, chances are, it's nothing personal. It's not about, like, I don't think anyone here's got a vendetta against anyone in particular. We're all fans of game audio and of anyone who's doing good work, irrespective of who they are. And we want to see and hear that stuff at GDC. That's fundamentally what our job is here. And we're all volunteers. So this is something that we're passionate about. We're giving up our time to do this. So if you've been rejected in the past, it's just because you've either just been really unlucky or your submissions are weak. And hopefully this podcast will help you get some insight into how to improve that. So shall we move on?
That's a great lead into, let's jump into this why wasn't my talk accepted list we sort of threw together hastily.
Yes.
So I added a couple at the top, which is that unusually, in the last couple of years, we've been in this situation where we have had more good talks than we knew what to do with. Normally, at the end of the meeting we have off-site, we'll get through everything. Because roughly, we've got something about 30 to 35 talks, something like that. It works like that, and it generally we'll struggle to fill that, and we'll fill up the rest of it by inviting talks and soliciting talks. We'll go out and we'll approach developers or projects that we think are really interesting audio experiences that we want to find more about, etc., etc. And the last couple of years, we haven't really had to do that. There's only been a couple of invited talks, and that's because there's been so much good stuff. So we've been turning down stuff that is good. So it's difficult to give people feedback when they've done a good submission and we're still turning it down. But as Scott alluded to at the start, if we've got this 30-something talks, they're subdivided. So no more than half of those are music related. The rest are going to be sound or tech centric. And then you've got things that are a bit more niche, like voice production, although it's a central part of the gameplay experience. It doesn't make any sense for us to have more than 2 or 3 voice-related talks on the audio track, because that would be getting to be more than 10% of the content. So if you're submitting a voice talk, there's going to be probably somewhere between 5 and 10 submissions on voice. So even if your talk is good, when it's starting getting to be a little bit more niche like that, then you're more likely to get rejected. So just be aware that it can happen even with a good submission. But having said that, in terms of mistakes that people make, let's cover some of that stuff.
There's a sort of on that note. Usually when we get them, talks fall into 3 categories. There are a small handful of talks which are like, oh yeah, we're taking this, boop, done. There are some number of talks, sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a few, that's like, there's no way, what was this person thinking? And those are cut. The vast majority of them are in that middle section. So, the ones that are in the we're not going to take this tend to be ones that very little effort was put into the submission. Just like we've had submissions that are literally just like 2 paragraphs that obviously didn't follow the directions of the website in terms of what we were looking for and so on. It's easy to put, when you have 100 talks and 25 slots, 28 slots, it's easy to put that one in the now that's okay pile. Let's see other ones. No clear takeaway was on the list here. These are talks that look like they have kind of a germ of an idea and there might be something cool there, but there's not this sort of, here's the key 1 or 2 things I really want the audience to take away from that. It's just this, nebulous kind of shuffling around, talking about this, talking about that. It's not quite sure what it wants to be. So think about it. It's like writing a composition or doing a great jazz hall, right? Have a direct message you want to send and make sure that everything in your submission advances that message you're trying to bring. That's definitely one of them. Want to keep going?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. Ad risk. Yeah, that's a giant red flag. What we mean by ad risk is a lot of times companies that do technology for game audio also, of course, want to present about their technology. That makes total sense, especially if it's something really cool and unique that people could hear about. Unfortunately, it's very easy for those talks to morph into the, here's this awesome problem, look at how our tool solves this problem. And that's not interesting to people. That sounds like an infomercial. So it's more challenging if you're at a company or at a production service or a music house or something like that has a solution and you kind of want to talk about that solution. If you are in that situation, be really careful about presenting a solution in an abstract notion. Don't say, first of all, don't mention your company name in your presentation at all. Don't say, yeah, this is the tool we make that does this. Instead, talk about some of the cool tech that you went into. How did you build this technology? What feedback did you have? Why did you choose this way of doing a UI for it or something like that?
Yeah, how can other people replicate that approach in their projects? Yeah. Or your other option is to pay a wad of cash to GDC in order to advertise at people in a sponsored session. And you see that. You see, a talk on the latest features in Unreal Engine brought to you by Epic Games. Like, they've paid for that.
There's some great talks like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not necessarily a mark of them being dull. They bought their way into the conference. In fact, if you've paid for your talk, you want to make sure you've done a good job. But yeah, it's just to be aware that that's the line there. It's either a paid for ad, and if it's not that, it's got to be abstracted away from promoting a particular product and be more about the approach and the how people can replicate that. Or don't submit. It's another option.
We talked before about the teaser submissions, which is the next one on the list. Which is basically, instead of saying what you're actually going to talk about, you just kind of hint at, what the problem is that you solved in a novel way, but not talking about the way that you actually solved it.
We'll talk about our awesome, innovative technique for having computers do real-time improvisation. That doesn't tell us a lot. If show us some examples, talk to us in the submission part about some of the techniques you did, how you'll explain about you tried this and it didn't work, you tried that, it did work, and so on. Again, it's not going to go in the abstract. You can have a teaser abstract, but the submission has to have some meat to it.
Yeah.
So on a similar line are the hypotheticals. And that is hypotheticals in quotes. And that is talking about something that you think would work really cool in a game, but you've never actually done it, except maybe on paper or as a thought experiment. GDC is, especially the program, you should hear the programmers rip to shreds submissions about this. With this.
You mean provide constructive feedback?
I mean, provide constructive feedback. Exactly what I meant, Scott.
But like, I can remember an exact. There was a talk that was submitted last year, which looked great in every way, apart from the fact that they hadn't shipped the game yet. That they were talking about how it was going to be. They'd learned so much from the last project, and I was like, awesome! You're going to have a great talk in like 2 years when you've applied that learning to your next game, and can come back and tell us about how that was either you were totally right or that you messed it up again. Like, that's a great talk.
Exactly.
If you're halfway through that thought process and you've not applied it yet, you can test us and see if we'll take it. But chances are you might want to sit in that for a little bit.
Experiences that you've gone through in real production environments, whether you're an indie mobile game as a composer or a sound designer or an audio producer, and have share that struggle in the process and what's lesson learned. That's obviously infinitely better than talking about some technology you think would be awesome that we're going to try over the next year.
Yeah, so one addendum I would make to the hypotheticals topic is the hypothetical game that is submitting on a game that hasn't yet shipped. We're happy to support you if you're comfortable and if your studio is comfortable having you talk about an unshipped game, but we've seen that happen several times as kind of an example of someone having to withdraw what we thought was a great talk submission, but the game either didn't ship or the game's PR... or the game's PR team decided that they weren't comfortable talking about the game because it hadn't yet shipped.
And that's
kind of something to keep in mind.
It's also been the case, I think, that a game which has shipped in the future but hasn't come out yet, and someone's done a talk on it, and the audience, because nobody has played it, so much of the talk has got to be about explaining about what the experience is. That A, that compromises the talk a little bit, and B, that would have just been better to just wait for the next year GDC, because then you've got people who are like, that game sounded amazing, I've got to go to this talk. But if you submit again, we're gonna be like, well, sorry, you spoke last year, we're not taking your talk again this year just because your game's now like much loved. So that's something to think about, is whether this is actually the right time to do your talk. Maybe it might be better waiting. So like that's a really subtle point, but it's something. I
remember something else to add. Sometimes we see a talk which is very basic, and we call these talks 101. And again, remember, GDC is a premier conference, so we won't take a talk that's like something you can go online on YouTube or on somebody's blog and read about it, because again, it cannot be too basic. Because people are paying a lot of money for admission and they want to learn the kind of stuff they cannot read online or they can't see on a tutorial on YouTube. So the level has to be beyond that 101 level. So be sure you're not submitting totally basic talks.
And similarly, you mentioned blogs. I think it has been the case in the past, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, but if you have written up this talk already and people can read about it, there's a question mark over whether there needs to be a talk about it. You might want to speak at GDC about that topic. There might be some people that want to hear it, but ultimately, if they can just read this information online, do you need to be speaking at GDC? Or maybe you're just taking up a slot. And so when we're getting to looking at these borderline cases where we've got to make difficult decisions about, who gets to speak and who doesn't, if the information is already out there, that can count against you. Like I say, it's not always the case, because sometimes a project can be just so interesting that we feel like it's worth having at GDC. But it's just another little thing to keep in the back of your head when you submit your talk.
And when we do accept those kinds of talks where there is sort of an existing version of that talk out there, I think one of the immediate pieces of feedback we have is how are you going to update it, revise it, make it, even more timely, more relevant to this audience versus someone who could have watched the talk that you gave at a different conference or that you captured online on your own website or that you wrote up as a paper.
Yeah, again, it's totally okay to submit on a similar topic that you've talked about or blogged about, but it's got to be, okay, it's deeper. I'll assume people have read that. Now, what above it? How can I provide more takeaway? It all gets down to takeaway.
So next in the list here, I added this one, and again, it's a bit of a hard one to communicate, but the issue of how many speakers that are presenting the talk is worth bringing up. We frequently, when a talk has multiple speakers, so more than one, we immediately start looking at why are there multiple speakers. Sometimes that's justifiable. Sometimes you've got a really obvious split in the skill set and the information that's being conveyed. Maybe you've got an audio director or sound designer plus a coder. Maybe you've got a composer and the sound designer from a project who are presenting different aspects of things, and that can work. But generally, sometimes people's motivation for having multiple speakers is either just because they're friends and it would be nice to do it together, or it might be political. Better, me and my boss might better do this talk together because it's awkward otherwise. And really, our main focus is on what is going to create the best. What is the best talk for attendees? And quite often, one speaker who is going through all the information and consistently, and not chopping, changing between speakers, can be the most concise way of getting that information across. So the rule generally is if one person can give a talk, then one person is the right number for doing that. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you've got multiple speakers, make sure it's justifiable, because if you can't justify it, we're gonna pick holes in it and make your life difficult.
And explicitly justify why you need multiple speakers.
Yeah. I mean, it's great if in the submission you say, and here's what person A is going to cover, and here's what person B is going to cover, and make sure that it's equitable. A couple of years ago, we had someone submit, I think, 4 speakers for a 25-minute session. That's going to be 5 minutes a person if you have Q&A. Even if you don't have Q&A. So if that's going to be the case, then great. If the format is, micro talks, which I think have been hugely successful over the last couple of years, then it makes sense. I'm expecting to see a large list of speakers. But if it's, sort of a postmortem of my game, and I have 6 people that I've submitted, and like I said, it's a 30-minute talk, then it's going to be hard to get into any depth, or you're going to have some people who, are just sitting there the whole time and don't actually get the opportunity to participate. And that's what we're looking for is, for equitable, participation in the conversation from everyone who's giving part of the talk.
But I wanted to add, we've had very successful lectures that were with 2 people or 3 people. And as you described, the situation was always where they divided the roles, and they were different roles, maybe an audio director and composer or sound designer. And the roles were very well delineated, and they also had done fantastic planning. I also wanted to say one more thing about the panels. I think in the last couple of years, we've had more successful 3-person talks where everybody prepared their presentation ahead of time, and the talk was very well structured and rigorous. And in the past, we've had panels where we thought the people would prepare, but they kind of sort of went and vamped, and they were not rated well at all. So again, the emphasis on preparation is very important. And when you that's one of the
common myths of panels is that you can just rock up and do it and you don't need to prepare. Yes, great. I'll do that talk, thank you. But of course, you do need massive preparation for a panel. And I think, sorry, Penka, I interrupted you. You've
no, it's okay. No, just the point I was making is that 3-person talk or 2-person talk works really well, and the preparation is really, really significant. But if we see that the panel is kind of randomly put together and looks like people are going to just vamp without preparation, without structure, most likely these kind of panels have a really hard time making it.
And that partly comes from GDC. Overall, the conference experience has been that these kind of panels can tend to have low takeaway. They tend to be the, hey, sign me up for a panel so I can get a free pass presentations. Oh, and on panels, again, panels are different than presentations. A 2-person or 3-person presentation is not a panel. A panel is a moderated, facilitated discussion. If you put together a panel session, we need to know the names and titles of everybody on that panel, because that's what makes a panel, not the topic. It's as much the people on the panel as the topic.
And also a first draft of the topics you plan to cover on that panel.
Yeah.
Here are the questions I'm going to ask the panelists. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian, you might want to weigh in on this a little bit now that we're talking about multi-speaker talks. One thing that has heartened me over the last couple of years is seeing submissions that include a non-audio person speaking in the audio track. And I know that Brian has also been an advocate for 1 or 2 audio talks, kind of going out and being submitted and being presented to the non-audio audience as well. Infiltrating, sorry.
Infiltrating.
We could go for that instead. Do you want to talk a little bit about how, what we're kind of looking for from the advisory board for a non-audio perspective in the audio track, and vice versa, when an audio person, it would make sense for them to submit a talk and say, well, this is actually more game design or programming?
Yeah, that's a great question. We heartily encourage submissions in other tracks. That's, part of making game audio better, which is what, we're here to do, is getting other people better educated about the industry. So first I'll speak to the submitting in other tracks. Obviously, the most important thing for submitting for another track is to remember the takeaway. The takeaway has to be, how is this going to make their job easier, their job better, them benefit from your experience? So if you're submitting a talk in the production track or the business track, talk about the business or production takeaways that you as an audio person are giving a perspective for. That's very different than, here are the issues I deal with as production and game audio. A talk like that given to the production track will almost certainly get kicked to the 4 of us. We'll be in that offsite I talked about. We'll get a knock on the door saying, hey, we think this talk is yours. Can you evaluate it? So be very clear to try and present it in such a way that it has a takeaway for a producer or a takeaway for a programmer. The primary takeaway is for a business person and so on. And that said, one thing, if you want, looking at the other side now, for submitting talks with non-audio people to talk on the audio track, we obviously are thrilled with that. If you want to team up with somebody who can give you a great point of view of what it is to, when you were working on this presentation, on this thing, and you want to talk about it now, you want to think about bringing somebody in who is not audio related, that weren't on the audio team, but that you interfaced with on a regular basis, or that was equally responsible for some of the audio success for the project. Bringing them in, having a significant amount of the content being from their perspective, because that helps our crowd know how to deal with the issues from their perspective. So that is sort of a little loophole, backdoor way of getting multiple speakers onto a talk, and it's a really good one. It has high takeaway value. Is that what you're thinking, Scott?
Yes. Thanks, Brian. An example of a facilitated question.
So the last thing that's on our list there, we've already spoken about lack of speaking experience. Get some experience. Is multiple submissions. This is more a footnote, which is, don't be that person that submits like 7 talks. Just don't do that.
Well, if you have 7 highly researched, well thought out, detailed presentations, that's
that
okay. But you won't.
Year.
You'll have 1/7 the amount of poor presentations. But yeah, right, it did happen last year. I remember that.
But which was like, it was like no one's got 7 good talks in them. There was a team who shall remain nameless who submitted many very good talks last year. But that is absolutely the exception. Generally speaking, you get an individual who submits like somewhere between maybe 5 and we have had 7 submissions from someone before. And the problem it creates for us is that apart from that exception last year, generally, clearly someone has just got this scattergun approach to, hey, I've got this idea and this idea and this idea, and none of them have had enough thought put into them to be something that we really can be like, well, great, let's take that. It would be much better if you submit 1 or 2 talks where you've taken the time to develop those ideas to a point where it's a no-brainer for us to take it, than it is that you just throw a few kind of back of napkin style ideas at us, because that just it's just kind of annoying for us, because we've got to read it and think about it and then discuss it and argue it, and it'd be just easier if you submitted 2 talks, because it's less work for us, and in a way for you too, hopefully.
I just wanted to give one. I just wanted to give one suggestion for all of you who have been attending GDC for a year or a couple of years. Think about the best talks you attended. Think about. I mean, I have vivid memories from talks I attended in 2011, and I gave my first talk in 2013. And actually, I got so inspired by a talk for creative work that I did later after the talk. So think about the kind of talks that inspired you the most, that you had such a light bulb went on and you thought to yourself, oh my God, the takeaway is so awesome. I'm going to go home right away and try this out. And think about the personalities. Think about who are your favorite speakers and why. And when you kind of visualize that and you remember that and what really inspired you from attending talks, then when you submit your proposal, try to be that person. Try to be inspiring. Try to be deeply researched. You have to research your topic very deeply. It has to be well thought out. And just be passionate about it, and then just work on convince us that you have a speaking experience if we don't know you well. But again, just think about your very best talks or very best lectures that you have heard at GDC and elsewhere, and try to be that.
The thing I would follow up with that is it's really easy if you're doing that to be intimidated by someone who's like so amazing that you're just like, I could never be that good. The important thing to understand is that someone who's impressed like that, really what they've done is they just put an absolute boatload of work into that. You know, they have obviously written this amazing talk, but they've also rehearsed it and rehearsed it and rehearsed it so that they are just ready to perform it and do this amazing thing. And that is the, like, you know, secret of a great talk is it's a lot of work. So be prepared to do that work too, so that you can be that person and be the best version of you on stage, which is a total lie because nobody's as cool as a great GDC talk. But that's what you're aiming for, is to like just blow people away with your preparedness and razor sharp intellect.
Preparedness.
Yeah, that's a word, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of gone through our common pitfalls. So there's some other little addendums here we've got. I think we've kind of covered that one. So do you have to be a rock star to have a chance of being accepted, your talk being accepted? Well, do you?
I mean, I think we've covered the broad characteristics that we're looking for. A great idea, the ability to communicate effectively and efficiently, the ability to inspire and to give people immediate takeaways. That is a rock star GDC talk. I don't know if that means you're a rock star in the broader sense of the word, but that I think is what we're looking for. I think the
question was probably alluding more to, do you have to be like famous within the world of game audio? Household name in game audio. One day. Out with gamers, yeah. And the answer to that is no. It's about the content. Obviously, it helps if you've worked on a project which is worth talking about.
And I won't be totally disingenuous here. Yes, a lot of people find it very interesting to hear about what it takes to put together a top-selling AAA title. And so in that sense, there is a little bit of a benefit to submitting, as a rock star or on a super well-known title, just because, that's kind of the aspirational goal that many people have, is to do that. So there's a little bit of a benefit to that, but it's not a substitute for good, solid takeaway.
So what kind of have we covered this? I don't know. I'll ask it, and you can tell me to shut up. What kind of things have you seen in talk submissions that make you go, yes, I'll take this? What are those characteristics?
I think we've sort of chatted. It's that list that Scott just said. It's this beautiful combination of a well thought out, well researched. You put effort into the submission. It's a timely topic that has a clear takeaway with a speaker which we have confidence that they will deliver a great talk. That's kind of the thing that's, like I said at the beginning, there's some of us, we scale them on a grade of 1 to 5. There are virtually no all 5s, but there's, a small handful are in the 4.5 plus range. Those are those talks. On the other end, what makes us say, we're going to pass on this. Those are ones that would be like aggregate average grade of 2 or less. Those are the things that we've also talked about. Poor takeaway, not well thought out, poor submission, inexperienced speaker. Nothing you did wowed us, right? Wow us. Your goal should be to make it into that 5. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Penka.
No, super niche, super obscure topic, and no reason for us to pick a really obscure topic because the takeaway will be very minimal.
Yeah.
Unless we're taking a gamble, which occasionally happens.
Yeah, well, once in a while we like those sort of wacky talk. The researcher who's doing some work on some synthesis technique that obviously won't be ready for prime time for another 5 years, but it's kind of cool and wacky and interesting, and it was such a well put together presentation or proposal that we might take something like that.
And it was submitted with actual examples, so it's not just
submitted with
this
examples.
Might be wacky and this might be innovative and interesting, or we actually hear it and we're like, no, this actually is compelling. It might still be on the horizon and not something you can do today, but we think that it's compelling and interesting enough to share with the community.
Yeah, there's definitely some amount of aspirational talks that we like to take. It's like, yeah, you're not going to do this right now, but this is conference is not the future of our industry, and I've been going to GDC for I think 26 years now, and it's changed a lot in 26 years, and it will continue to change 26 years in the future.
No, we're done. Game audio's a solved problem.
I have a quote with John Carmack saying that.
From 26 years ago.
I kept it as an MP3 file. Game audio is essentially done. He said that in 2003, I think.
Yeah, and I
like to play it whenever I can.
Oh no, I've heard. I was interviewing an audio coder once who said that in an interview. I was just like, what? Oh dear. Anyway,
all right, we digress.
What?
VR question. Are we going to touch on that VR question that popped up? How people who should there was a VR question that was put on Facebook. Are we going to tackle that?
Yeah, I think
we probably should now that you brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah. So like someone had asked, there's the VRDC, which is a completely separate conference at a different time of year to GDC, but there's also the VRDC track at GDC. And they have audio talks that are obviously VR related audio talks at them. And this is someone who is a VR audio developer who is asking, which one should I submit for? And for me, the line between those is if you are putting together a VR audio talk that's aimed at audio developers, then by all means submit that to the audio track at GDC. If you're putting together a VR audio talk that is aimed at VR developers, so people who aren't audio specialists, that's a great talk for VRDC. Because the audience isn't, the majority of the audience is probably going to be non-audio people, so you're going to have to skew your presentation and the takeaway towards that audience anyway. So that for me is the difference between the two, and so it's like hardcore versus slightly higher level.
Yeah, from a logistical perspective, VRDC is co-hosted with GDC, but it's usually Monday and Tuesday. Brian, you can tell me if it's changed this year, but I believe that's still the case. Mm-hmm. So it is presented alongside the tutorial tracks and the summit tracks and the audio bootcamp, by the way. And so because VRDC is its own pass, you generally don't have a lot of audio-focused specialists in the VR track other than the people who are there with the giant giga Uber pass. I don't remember what the terminology is for the one pass that encompasses both conferences at this point. But that's another reason. Exactly, but that's another one of the reasons why, if you're going to submit for VRDC, you will want to keep in mind that a significant portion of your audience is probably not going to be, audio focused in their 100% role.
Right, and VRDC has a separate selection process from GDC, so don't think, oh, I submitted for VRDC, therefore I shouldn't submit for GDC.
Yeah.
I had one other thing I wanted to raise, which is in terms of diversity. I think if you were submitting a panel that was all men, and it quite clearly could have had someone who wasn't a man,
which is the case.
Then
any panel you put together, you can put together a diverse panel.
Yeah, so please make an effort there, because that, again, when we're coming down to these decisions about which talks not to take when it's borderline, if you haven't made that effort, it's really easy for us to say, all right, we'll pass on that. In reality, if we were to take a talk, we would ask you probably to swap out someone on it for someone else, and so you're gonna have to do that work at some point anyway. So you might as well do it when you're submitting, because it'll be favorable for you.
And that's also a big part of the policy of GDC. It's not something that we do on a whim, but that's actually a big part of the philosophy and mission of GDC, to be sensitive to diversity, to include diversity, and to just be forward thinking and be progressive. It's year 2017.
Cool. Yeah, so I think that's a great point to finish on.
I was going to say, on that note.
Yeah. Thank you guys all for joining the conversation. Thanks to everyone online and everyone who I talked to last year at GDC who said, how does this particular sausage get made? Hopefully this helped peel back the layers, to mix some metaphors a little bit.
Peel back the layers of the sausage.
No. Control Z. We can cut that part out in post, right?
From male panels to sausages. Great. That's perfect.
Luck with your submissions.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. We look forward to your submissions.
Cool. All right. Well, cheers.
See you at GDC.
Bye.
Bye-bye.